All right. Are we going? Okay. All right. We are starting our class on harmony of the Gospels. And I want to thank Jerry for his class last week. I listened to it this week, and it was a very good introduction into our study by acquainting us with some of the things that happened between the Testaments, particularly the 400 years of silence after Malachi to Matthew. And we will look at a little bit of that again today as we kind of do an introduction. I was telling Gerald before, when I first came in, that this has been a very difficult class for me to get my arms around because I've been trying to figure out how the best approach is. I don't really want to just look at, okay, here's what Matthew says, here's what Mark says, and Luke, and so forth, because I don't think that gives us a picture much of what's going on in the four Gospels. And so I've looked at initially, and I'm not going to guarantee you I won't change my mind between next week, but initially here's kind of what I'm looking at. And that is, we'll look at what the Gospels have to say about John the Baptist, his birth and his childhood, whatever we can glean from them relative to that. Some of the preparatory work that John did relative to the coming of the Messiah. And we'll try to review very quickly some of the Old Testament prophecies about John, who he was, and some of the things said about him in the Old Testament, his preachings, and then his death. That's one way to look at some of the things. Then we'll look at, I want to focus more on Jesus, on Christ, and what the Gospels have to say about him, about from his birth to his manhood, through his preaching and teaching, what we can understand from the Scripture about his growing up, the beginning of his public ministry, his first public appearance, and then go on down through some of those kind of things and look at what the Gospels have to say about his efforts during the time that he was on earth. And then we'll look at his trial, his birth, or his death and his resurrection, and some of those things. This morning I want us to kind of go through the writers of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and look at who they were when they wrote, to the best of our knowledge. It's very difficult to put an exact time on when the Gospels were written. I think it's safe to say they were written sometime between 50 AD and 90 AD, and that's about as close as you can get with some of them. So we will look at some of the things we know about it. But when you look at these four Gospels, what comes to your mind when you look at what's the main point of the four Gospels? Joe.
Just establish that Jesus is the fulfillment of all that Old Testament promise.
All right.
Establish that he is the promise that God made to Abraham, or I guess the garden.
They give the story of his life, God incarnate, and they're written to different groups of people, and that's why we see, I think, different things discussed in these Gospels. Matthew, for example, was a Jew. And he reveals Christ more as the Messiah and King of the Jews. One thing I was looking at this morning is he wrote for the Jews. His gospel is more directed at the Jews than any of the other three. This morning, I woke up about 4 o'clock and I was lying there and couldn't get comfortable, and there was some things going through my mind relative to the class this morning, and I wasn't happy with some of the preparation I had done. So I finally got up about 4:30, showered and shaved, and went in, made myself a cup of coffee, and went into my office and worked on some of that till about 6, and got Sharon up and ate breakfast and then went back. And so anyway, some of this stuff I have run across this morning. But one of the things I ran across was a statement by William Barclay in his commentary on Matthew. And he says, when we turn to Matthew, we turn to the book which may well be called the most important single document of the Christian faith. For in it we have the fullest and the most systematic account of the life and the teachings of Jesus. And so Matthew begins his gospel how? What's the first thing you run across when you read Matthew's account? The genealogy of Christ. How does Matthew give the genealogy? In segments, right. And we'll talk more about those in future classes. But who does Matthew take the genealogy through? All right, he goes back to Abraham. Pardon? Takes it through Joseph. I think he gives this genealogy relative, as we said, he's writing to Jews. And so he writes the genealogy to convince the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. And so when he gives his genealogy, he shows the Jews that it was the fulfillment of prophecy, taking it through Joseph back to Abraham. And this was something that was important to the Jews because they were able to track who they were and who the descendants were, who the priests could be, and all of those kind of things. And that's one of the significant things about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70 by the Romans, is that they destroyed all those records. And so that was one of the things we have to keep in mind as we think about the establishment of the church that we see in Acts, that there was a period of time from the resurrection of Christ until AD 70 when there was kind of this dual system going on. The Jews were still offering sacrifices. The temple was still there. And there was still the Jewish worship, the Jewish economy that was in force, and it was still going on. Yes, Christ had died. He had nailed the old law to the cross, and those kind of things. But at the same time, there was still a lot of the old law worship that was going on. After AD 70, that pretty well ceased because the Jews couldn't verify who was a priest. They couldn't verify the descendants of Levi and those kind of things. And so it finally brought an end to the Jewish economy. There's a statement, and you may disagree with it, that's fine. But it's made by John the Baptist, and he says, even now the axe is laid at the root of the tree. I think that's a statement by John relative to the total destruction of the Jewish economy, the total destruction of the law and the worship of the law, the temple destruction and all that. But that's just my opinion on that. So. But the genealogy was important to the nation of Israel. And so Matthew gives the genealogy in a way to establish and to show that Jesus filled two specific prerequisites to be the Messiah. First of all, he had to be a descendant of Abraham. And that's what Matthew shows, is he takes the genealogy back to Abraham. Second thing that he showed is he had to be whose descendant? David. Had to be a descendant of David. There's also an interesting thing. If he wasn't a descendant of Abraham, if he wasn't a descendant of David, he couldn't be the Messiah. So Matthew's gospel kind of settles this issue. He says, here you can look at the records, you can see how he was a descendant of Abraham, how he was a descendant of David. But how does Luke record? Luke's the only other gospel writer that records the answer. Yeah, Gerald.
Muddy the water too much, but I don't understand this genealogy going to Joseph, how that ties it back to David. Joseph wasn't his father.
I think that he's just showing how the Jews considered it through the male as the legal, kind of the legal way. Luke's genealogy goes back through Mary all the way to Adam. And I think that just shows, Luke shows the bloodline, and Matthew shows more of the legal aspects. Although Joseph wasn't he was his adopted son or adopted father, however you want to look at it. But so now here's a question. He was shown to be the descendant of David, but and God had promised this in the Old Testament, but look at what how do we do that? We think he doesn't take it back through Solomon. Who does he take it back through? You have to kind of rummage around to find that. He takes it back through. Trying to think. Nathan, who was also a son of Solomon. He actually takes it back through Solomon, but he doesn't take it back through Jeconiah, who was the king. And then and you remember what the old Jeremiah says, that he promised in Jeremiah 22 that no son or descendant would rule on the throne of David. That is, descendants of Jeconiah, who was the king following Solomon. Terrible king, terrible. And his son, I was trying to think of his name. Who? Well, there was one after Jeconiah. I can't think. I'll have to find that. But anyway, so the question then arises: well, if no son of Jeconiah would sit on the throne of David, how could Christ be a descendant of David? So he takes it through Nathan. If you read, I think it's in if you look at that genealogy, there's a Nathan in there. May depend upon the translation that you have.
And Luke's is like,
Hmm?
in Luke's genealogy, he goes through Nathan.
The point I think that we need to keep in mind is that Matthew's genealogy is more the legal, from the Jewish standpoint, it's the legal descendancy of the Messiah because it's through the male. In Luke's account, it's more the fleshly or the bloodline of Christ. Yes.
Was it Zedekiah? After Jeconiah, Zedekiah?
Yeah, I think so.
Judah?
I'll have to go back and look at that. So he was more the heir through the flesh, through the bloodline, by Mary. But the point that Matthew is getting across is he's showing the kingly aspects of Christ. In fact, if you look at Matthew 21 and Matthew 27, in Matthew 21, I think that's where he comes into the city riding on a donkey. And if you go back to Zechariah, I think it's Zechariah, about the 9th chapter, talks about him coming into the city on the king coming in riding on a donkey. And then in Matthew, the 27th chapter, he's before Pilate. Remember what Pilate asked him? Are you what? Are you a king? And Jesus said, yes, I am. And so Matthew is showing the kingly elements of who he was. And so when we think about who wrote Matthew, who do you think wrote Matthew? Not a trick question. I think kind of the early church historians mostly considered Matthew, the tax collector that was an apostle of Jesus Christ, one of the 12, as the writer. Some of the later scholars have questioned whether it was written by him, but Matthew is named one of the 12 apostles. What's another name for Levi? for Matthew? Levi.
Son of Alphaeus.
Okay, easy question. Who was he the son of?
Alphaeus.
Alphaeus. Who else was the son of Alphaeus? James. So there's some question, were these two brothers? I don't know. You know, when you look at some of these names, there's a lot of different people in the scripture that carry the same name, so you kind of have to sort through all of the things to figure it out. But Matthew was one of the 12, and Matthew's account then would have been what we would think of as a first-hand account or an eyewitness account of Christ and the things that he writes about Christ. Luke, on the other hand, was Luke an eyewitness? No. So he depended upon other information about the things that he wrote. And so as we look at Matthew's account, that he followed Jesus or he was with Christ through a lot of these things. And if you read some of the historical accounts, some of the non-inspired accounts by guys like Irenaeus and Clement of Alexander, and some of those early church historians, they say that Matthew preached the gospel in Judea and then went to other places, but where we don't know. So that's kind of what we know about Matthew. And the traditional idea is kind of that it was written probably sometime between 50 and 60 AD. So these are some of the earlier writings of the New Testament. Mark. Who was Mark? John Mark's one. That's a lot of people think that that's who he was, is that he wrote the things that Peter dictated, much like Paul had someone to write for him. He just dictated it. In fact, there are some that think that Mark probably wrote a lot of things that Peter had given to him. So there's a lot of questions there. But his primary focus in the Gospel of Mark is Jesus, the suffering servant. And he wrote, one of the things I looked at this morning was he wrote his gospel is primarily directed at Romans or the Gentiles, although he was a Jew. And from the best we can determine, he died in Egypt somewhere in the mid-60s. Barnes suggests that Mark was written sometime between 56 and 63 AD. So you begin to get this idea that no one knows for sure when these were written. I mean, there's a pretty good range, particularly when we look at John. John could have been written somewhere from 50 to 90, just depending. But one of the things that's interesting about the Gospel of Mark is that many of the things that Jesus taught, many of the sermons that are taught by Jesus that are included in Matthew and Luke, Mark doesn't deal with those. So we kind of have to look at at the things Mark has to say to determine who he was writing to. But his gospel seems more pointed toward the Gentiles than the Jews because he doesn't contain any Old Testament passages like Matthew does relative to the Messiah, the prophecies about the Messiah, and showing how Christ fulfilled all of those Old Testament prophecies as Matthew does. Mark doesn't do that. But if you look at Mark, he includes a lot of explanation of Jewish language and customs. In other words, it seems that he's writing to people that may not be that familiar with the Hebrew language, may not be that familiar with a lot of the Jewish customs. And so Mark kind of explains some of those things as you go through. He doesn't include anything about the birth of Jesus or anything about his early years. And he writes very little about John the Baptist. In contrast to Matthew and some of the other writers. But I think John Mark is considered probably the one that wrote the gospel. Who's he related to? Barnabas. He was a cousin of Barnabas. And in Acts, the 12th chapter, his mother was Mary. And she apparently had a fairly large house because in Acts, the 12th chapter, verse 12, says that the disciples gathered together in her house. And so she apparently had a fairly large place. Barnabas, as we said, was his cousin. He was a Levite from where? Cyprus. Mark traveled with Paul, any? A little bit. First missionary trip, he started out with Paul and Barnabas. Didn't last too long, did he? But I think as you think about it, he was probably a very young man. And as a result, wasn't really mentally prepared to deal with all the things that were happening to Paul and to Barnabas on that trip. And so as they started their second trip, Paul and Barnabas had a little bit of a falling out because Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them. Paul didn't. And so they went separate ways. Paul ever reconciled with John Mark? Remember what he says in 2 Timothy, what is it, 3rd chapter, 4th chapter? He says, send John Mark, for he is valuable. He's useful to me. And it appears that John Mark was with Paul quite a bit from different times. As you read Philemon and Colossians, he is identified as one who is a fellow laborer with Paul, one who was a comfort to Paul. So we see in John Mark how people can grow, how they can change, and sometimes that just takes time. And I think that was the case with John Mark, is that he had not really, when Paul and Barnabas went on their first trip, he wasn't really prepared for that kind of life, but he eventually grew. Peter, he was apparently spent quite a bit of time with Peter, because in 1 Peter 5 in verse 13, Peter calls him his son. Fleshly son. probably a convert by Peter, his son in the faith. And in 1 Peter 5, verse 13, it says he was in Babylon. I think that may be Rome, but that's just a big question mark after that, so you can look at that. As Ron pointed out, he was with Peter, and there's a fairly good evidence that he was kind of the penman for Peter, and he wrote the things that Peter dictated. But I think it's fairly reasonable to date his gospel before AD 70, because there's no mention of the destruction of the temple, which would have been a significant event in AD 70. And so, as we said, 55 to 65. You can pick your time in there as to when it was written, but that's a pretty good range. Okay, Luke his focus is on Jesus, the Son of Man. And I think Luke wrote mostly for Greeks. I read something the other day that there's some that have the idea he was a Hellenistic Jew. And that, but I think it's more likely that he was a Gentile, that he wasn't a Jew. It has also been suggested that he was a Greek physician. Paul calls him a physician in his writings, but that he was a physician to a Roman family who at some point set him free and gave him Roman citizenship. Of all of the gospel writers, he may be the only Gentile of the four. Who is it written to? Most excellent Theophilus. Same way he starts the book of Acts, isn't it? I read somewhere, so it aroused my curiosity, and I went through it, that he wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else. And I thought, well, that can't be right when you look at all the things Paul wrote. So I went through this morning, and there between the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles, there's something like 54 chapters. If you look at all of Paul's writings, there's something like 80-something chapters. Now, I didn't count the words, so I can't tell you that there's more words in Luke and Acts than in Paul's writings, but those are just some of the little things you run across. The thinking is that he was probably converted in Antioch, is where he obeyed the gospel. In Acts, as you go through, how do you know Luke is with Paul a lot of the times?
Uses the pronoun we. Uses the pronoun.
Yeah, the pronoun we. A lot of times you'll see the writing where he says, we did this and we were doing so forth. And then other times it's obvious that he's not there because he doesn't record it that way. But he shows that Jesus was one who kind of shared man's sorrows, and it was written probably during Paul's first Roman imprisonment. And if it was written at that time, it would have been written sometime about the early 60s, but and that may be the case, since he doesn't mention anything about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But if you look at Luke, first of all, he wasn't an eyewitness of Christ. He came after that. He was a companion of Paul. He was a physician. In fact, that's what Paul calls him in Colossians 4 and verse 14. He was a Gentile, and as we said, maybe the only Gentile writer of the four Gospels. And I also found the summary that he was a major gospel writer, and that's where the guy said he wrote more of the New Testament than any other writer, and that stirred my interest to look at that. Any thoughts about Luke? John.
But he was in a position to talk to other eyewitnesses that were still alive,
Yeah.
people that had not necessarily been.
He was obviously someone that was very methodical in the way he approached things, kind of the scientist approach to things. But as we look at the Gospel of John, how do you characterize Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Synoptics. Why?
Well, they contain a lot of the same material. I mean, 70% of Mark is found in Matthew.
Yeah. There's a lot of, they focus mainly on Christ in the regions of Galilee and some of the upper regions. John, on the other hand, deals mainly with events that are not found in the other three Gospels. As Jesus was more down around Jerusalem and Judea in that region.
John didn't have any parables either.
No. So the Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to a lot of times as the synoptic gospels because they are more deal with common things and a lot of the same events. But John is written, Matthew writes more to the Jews. I think Mark and Luke are more to the Gentile population. John seems to be more written to the whole world. In fact, I ran across one guy who says John was written to the church. And I think that's a reasonable way to think about it. John gives us in John the 20th chapter the purpose of the life of Christ. Remember what John says, where is it, about verse 30 in John 20? It says not everything that Christ did was written down because there's not enough room to write all those things down. But he goes on to say these things are written. In other words, the things that John has recorded, he said these are written. Why? That you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that believing you might have life. And so he shows Jesus as deity. Remember how he begins the gospel? In the beginning was the Word. Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then if you go down to verse 14, he said the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. we beheld him as the glory of the only begotten of the Father. So he not only declares him as deity, but he shows us the glory of the Father as he came to earth. What's another name for John? What Jesus called him? He and his brother. Sons of thunder. You know, you think of John as kind of this meek little guy. He was called the one that Jesus loved. And we think of John as kind of being this even-tempered kind of guy. But go over to Luke, the 9th chapter, and about verse 54. Jesus is making his way back to Jerusalem for the last time, and he's coming through Samaria. And the apostles are sent to kind of prepare things, and the Samaritans don't want anything to do with it because his face, the scripture says, is set toward Jerusalem. And you remember what James and John asked Jesus to do? Said, do you want us to just call down fire like Elijah did? I mean, let's just call down fire and consume all of them. Get rid of them. If they don't want to have anything to do with you, we'll just get rid of them. And so that's one of the things about John that's kind of a contrast to what we normally think about his personality. And as we read the things that he wrote and how he writes them, who was his father? Zebedee. Salome was his mother. And so we read about James and John, the sons of Zebedee. He also wrote, of course, the three epistles, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation. As I say, when you look at when John was written, it could have been somewhere in about a 30-year period, 60 to 90 A.D. If it was written more closer to the time I think Revelation was written, which would have been close to 90 or in the early 90s, John was the only surviving eyewitness of the Lord at that time. As the first century kind of comes to an end, all the other apostles have been put to death. The tradition says he wrote the gospel in Ephesus. I don't know where he was. But he appears to have outlived all of the other apostles, and he appears to have been the only apostle to die a natural death. All the rest of them were, best we can determine, martyred. But that kind of fits with what Jesus told Peter, doesn't it? That if John, he says, Peter asked, well, what about John? But we know it was John. What about him? And you remember what Jesus said? If he lives till, he said, don't worry about that. If he lives till I return. And so there's some that have developed the idea, well, John's still running around alive somewhere because Christ hadn't returned. But that's not the point Jesus was making. Wasn't any of Peter's business to worry about John. Peter ought to just worry about himself. Okay. Well, we'll figure out how we're going to go about this for next week. And we'll start looking at some of the things about John the Baptist, what the Old Testament has to say about John the Baptist, what the the Gospels have to say about the birth of John and the preaching of John and how it relates to the coming of the Messiah.